The Americo-Liberian Legacy and Indigenous Relations. What happens when freedom brings new chains? Liberia's story begins with a bold experiment, a nation founded by freed African Americans on African soil. Yet, this union of the freed and the indigenous would weave a complex tapestry of hope, hierarchy, and struggle that still shapes Liberia today. The Americo-Liberian Legacy and Indigenous Relations. Liberia, a small West African nation nestled along the Atlantic coast, is unique in its history. Unlike other African countries that were carved out by European colonial powers, Liberia was established in the early 19th century by freed African Americans. This unusual beginning gave rise to a society that carried both the aspirations and contradictions of its founders, resulting in a complex legacy of division and resilience. A new home across the Atlantic. In 1822, the American Colonization Society, ACS, facilitated the settlement of freed African Americans on the West African coast. The ACS's motives were varied. Some sought to provide freed African Americans with opportunities for self-determination, while others saw colonization as a way to address racial tensions in the United States. For the freedmen and women who crossed the Atlantic, Liberia symbolized a chance to start anew, far from the chains of slavery. The settlers, who came to be known as Americo-Liberians, established Monrovia, named after U.S. President James Monroe, a supporter of the colonization effort. They brought with them a strong sense of identity shaped by their experiences in America, including Christianity, Western education, and democratic ideals. Yet their arrival also marked the beginning of a fraught relationship with the indigenous peoples who had lived on the land for centuries. Settlers and natives. The two Liberias. The Americo-Liberians viewed themselves as torchbearers of civilization, tasked with uplifting what they saw as the uncivilized indigenous communities. This perspective was influenced by their own experience of oppression in the United States. However, it ironically led them to impose a similar hierarchy in Liberia. The settlers established a government modeled after the United States, but this system excluded indigenous Liberians from meaningful participation. Voting rights, education, and access to leadership roles were primarily reserved for the Americo-Liberians. Indigenous Liberians, who made up the majority of the population, were marginalized, taxed without representation, and subjected to forced labor in some instances. Despite these inequities, indigenous leaders sought to engage with the new settlers. They entered into treaties, traded goods, and in some cases converted to Christianity. Yet these interactions were often lopsided, with the settlers dictating terms. Over time, resentment grew among indigenous communities, sowing the seeds of future conflict. Cultural syncretism and tensions. While political and social divisions deepened, Liberia also became a melting pot of cultures. Americo-Liberians introduced Western-style clothing, architecture, and education, while adopting aspects of indigenous traditions, including local cuisine and languages. This blending of cultures created a unique Liberian identity, but did little to bridge the gap between the two groups. Indigenous Liberians often viewed the settlers with suspicion, seeing them as outsiders who sought to dominate rather than integrate. On the other hand, Americo-Liberians clung tightly to their identity, fearing that full integration would dilute their control and erode the values they had sought to preserve. Struggles for unity. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Liberia faced external pressures that threatened its sovereignty. European colonial powers, particularly Britain and France, encroached on Liberian territory, forcing the government to cede land. These challenges prompted some Americo-Liberians to seek alliances with indigenous communities, but such efforts were often superficial. One notable figure during this era was President Edward J. Roy, an Americo-Liberian of mixed heritage, who attempted to advocate for broader inclusion of indigenous voices. His efforts were short-lived, and he was deposed in a coup. The cycle of exclusion continued, with Americo-Liberians maintaining control over Liberia's political and economic systems. The turning point, mid-20th century. The 20th century brought significant changes to Liberia. As anti-colonial movements swept across Africa, calls for greater inclusion and equality grew louder. Indigenous leaders began to demand representation and an end to systemic discrimination. The presidency of William V.S. Tubman, 1944 to 1971, marked a turning point. Tubman, an Americo-Liberian, introduced the unification policy, which aimed to integrate indigenous Liberians into the political and economic fabric of the nation. He extended voting rights to indigenous men, promoted infrastructure development in rural areas, and sought to foster a sense of national unity. Despite these efforts, deep-seated inequalities persisted. Many indigenous Liberians felt that the reforms were too little, too late, while some Americo-Liberians resisted sharing power. The tensions simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. Collapse and reconciliation. By the 1980s, Liberia's socio-political landscape had become a powder keg. Samuel Doe, an indigenous soldier, seized power in a coup in 1980, ending over a century of Americo-Liberian dominance. His rule, however, was marked by authoritarianism and ethnic favoritism, plunging the country into further turmoil. The divisions between Americo-Liberians and indigenous groups contributed to the outbreak of Liberia's civil wars in the late 20th century. These conflicts devastated the nation, claiming thousands of lives and displacing millions. The wars forced Liberians to confront the legacies of inequality and exclusion that had plagued the country for generations. In the aftermath, Liberia began the arduous process of rebuilding. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Africa's first female president, led efforts to promote reconciliation and unity. Her administration emphasized the need to move beyond the divisions of the past and foster a shared sense of identity. A legacy of lessons. Today, Liberia continues to grapple with the legacy of its Americo-Liberian founders and their relationship with indigenous communities. While progress has been made in fostering inclusion, the scars of the past remain. Liberia's story is a testament to the complexities of nation-building, particularly when diverse groups with different histories and worldviews must coexist. It is also a reminder of the resilience of its people, who have endured and rebuilt in the face of immense challenges. As Liberia looks to the future, its history serves as both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration. The journey toward unity is far from over, but the lessons of the past provide a roadmap for creating a more equitable and inclusive society.